John the Baptist's message demonstrates something of God's heart to us. And Jesus himself, when he came, he sort of reflected many of the things that we see with John the Baptist. And John's message, as well as Jesus' example, shows us a very practical application of what it means to follow God and a generous spirit. And one of the things that we might start to see when we look at these messages is that there seems to be an emphasis on the poor and hungry through both John the Baptist and Jesus' messages. And this challenges us to consider a theme that I've begun to suggest we've seen develop in the last 60 years within church theology. It's not all good, I have to say, but there are many aspects of it which is useful for us to consider. And that is asking us the question of what is our theology of the poor? Or, to put it another way, people have called it liberation theology. We live in a world of inequality. We live in a world of injustice, and we live in a world where many people are poor. Living in the UK, in the West, that automatically makes me richer than a significant percentage of the rest of the world. And when we look at the inequality across our globe, with parts of the world where we're throwing away food and other parts of the world where people are going hungry, famine is impacting, we start to realise that God never designed the world that way. He created a perfect world, and that perfect world was sustainable, it was healthy, it had everything that was needed for people to be able to live in and live successfully. And we know that sin came in and polluted that world, that there was a sense of sin corrupting God's perfect creation. What we also see when we look at the wider world is we see very clearly man's inhumanity to man. We see that the world is full of greed, of selfishness, and all those things impact. And so often people suffer as a result, and consequently we live in a world of inequality where we do have poor people in the world. There's poor in different levels and in different countries, but God never created it that way. God's heart is that his people should reflect his heart in the way that we do life. God's heart is that his people should reflect his nature and live with that sense of going in the opposite spirit to those things that we see in the world. That was nowhere more obvious than the picture of Israel, where Israel was described and designed to be a fruitful vine that was planted into the land flowing with milk and honey. It was planted into the promised land. And the idea was that this planting into the promised land as a fruitful vine would spread out and be a blessing to the whole world. The purpose of the people of Israel planted in the promised land was to demonstrate the nature of God to the world, to bring salvation and reconciliation, and to show that God's heart and God's values are different to those of the world. Now, we know that the picture we see of Israel was that they never lived up to that potential that they were meant to. And when Jesus came, Jesus offered us the ultimate example of what it means to be a follower of God and to be part of the kingdom of God. And the challenge for the church to grapple with is, if God created everything perfect and sin polluted it, how do we respond to the inequality and the inhumanity that we see and the suffering of so many people around our world?